Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you, Lisa, for the film. The film which just debuted at the RXSM Festival in Austin.
Yes.
And this is my third time seeing it, and as I was preparing for the Q&A, I realized that for the first time, you always start with the generic question of what inspired you to make this? And I thought this is something that is so resonant with all of us, this idea of that we are our memories, which actually aren't that much, which aren't anything, that it didn't even occur to me to think to ask you that. It's like, oh, okay, I understand why she made it, but I actually don't know why you made it. So what inspired you? Did the idea come before the experts that speak, the scientists are from a Radio Lab show on NPR? Was that something that sparked the idea? Was the idea already there, and then that kind of solidified it?
I think I started first with the shooting at Coney Island, as it was being fought over by developers. And it would have just been a random shooting day that I like to do, but it seemed to have a beginning, middle, and end and I just couldn't leave it to some exercise. And over time, I wasn't sure what I was saying with it and how I was going to cut it, and these other elements just very naturally, because it took me about 4 years to make it, so it's a 10-minute film, but it wasn't about, I didn't start off with anything, but these elements kind of started to interweave for me, and so each element has its own beginning, middle, and end, and I wanted to see if by the end we could reach what I call grace. I mean, it was the combination of all these things that let you experience the loss and memory in a beautiful way and accept them.
Do you think in the middle of that process, in those 4 years, you moved from New York, where you'd been living for a very long time, to Paris? Do you think that, in a sense, that helped you find an end, that was what inspired you or stimulated you to find that grace?
I think on a personal level, Paris has been helpful for that, but I had more or less picture-locked it, and the elements were interwoven in a way that I was appreciating maybe before I left. It was the sound design was really complicated, and that took about 2 years.
Who did the sound design?
Amy Norwich, a musician in Brooklyn, who she's just hardcore bassist, makes several kinds of her own basses. Like she's brilliant, but she'd never scored or composed for film before. So we began this really complicated conversation, and I knew that I wasn't going to use any sound that I'd had. I wanted to, for the first time, be completely expressionistic. So it took a really long time to work with a musician who had not really scored it. So it was a long conversation for us, and it was very rewarding for me, and for her as well. I wish it was here. It would make more sense.
It's interesting because this film is about the ephemeral nature of memories, and which are basically our stories, which is how we know ourselves, which is how we construct our own lives. And the fact that there is absolutely no closure because they are fleeting, and they're things that we keep reinventing. And yet this is a finished piece. This is something that has presumably brought you closure that you now walk away from, as the rest of us are left to mull over it.
I feel like that's why you make things. That's why I make things. I don't know. I can't speak to people that make narrative films. I can make narrative films too, but something like this, when it's organic and being created in front of me and using elements of my life or whatever, however I'm interweaving it, I felt very much like I was putting some question in a box that I'd answered for myself. I don't know if that's what people feel when they see it, but for me, I've answered a question, and there it is.
Maybe we can get a reaction from people on how they felt from seeing it. Are there any questions?
I sort of saw it as a poem of loss to New York City. I kind of took a beautiful reflection of that. I could say a poem. A lot of people now sort of become aware of the loss of the city or whatever, and I think that really kind of reflects and shows the loss of Coney Island. From a very, or not
So
Thank you, Clayton.
he said that it's like a poem about the loss of New York City, about the loss of Coney Island and so many things that are being lost right now.
That's accurate. I mean, among other things, for sure.
How do you feel now when you come back to New York? Or is
I-
it still too soon to
I can't walk down 10th Street where I lived for 10 years. But I like it.
Any other questions?
Thank you all for staying. I did.
Actually, I wanted to ask you one last thing. You talked about narrative films, and we've talked about it before. You told me before that you do want to do a narrative film. You want to make a narrative film.
The next
Do you
film.
have an idea that's germinating in your mind?
It's going to be a road trip through Texas. This is what I know for sure. But I've spent all this time on various experimental elements that I actually now want to apply narratively. It's time.
About women, men, kids?
It's too complicated to talk about quite yet, but it's going to be a very feminist road trip through Texas.
Which will have
Slightly
to come back.
experimental. What?
Which will have to come back here. And then.
Potentially. Yeah, exactly. Stay tuned.
Anything else? Do we have any other questions? Well, thank you all. Thank you for staying. Thank you for coming out. And enjoy the next film, which is 5 Star. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.